At the age of 5, Michael Jackson stopped being a child and became a project built for success. The world gained a star, but he lost the right to exist as a human being. Today, we are not going to analyze Michael Jackson as that strange or eccentric artist full of controversies. This video is about something much deeper. We are going to understand Michael as the result of family and industry pressure that shaped him through physical and emotional blows. His life was the stage for a battle between two opposing psychic forces. On one hand, a grand, exceptional, powerful being, capable of hypnotizing entire stadiums. But on the other hand, an ashamed, dependent child self that never fully developed because he was robbed of his right to childhood. Michael learned that in order to be loved, he had to stop being a child, but he also had to be perfect. And he spent the rest of his life trying to recover that lost childhood, while sinking into a destructive spiral searching for an unattainable perfection. Stay until the end. Pay attention to this video because you're going to learn how relational trauma, family exploitation, and very deep body shame ended up dissolving his identity. And even though his story is extreme, there's a lot we can learn from it for our own lives, about the masks we all wear to be accepted, about the price we pay when our worth depends on what we do and not who we are, and about the power that childhood has to shape our personality. I'm Claudia Nicolasa, a psychologist. Subscribe for more psychological analyses. Michael was born in Gary, Indiana, an impoverished area with few opportunities. In his house, with only 2 rooms, Michael, his parents, and his 8 siblings lived crowded together. But his father was determined that they would get out of that situation thanks to his children's musical talent, no matter the price to pay. Because he was not only very strict and demanding with his children, and his verbal, emotional, and physical abuse is also well documented.
How often would he beat you?
Too much.
Michael himself said that his father would sit with a belt while making them rehearse, ready to punish them harshly for even the slightest mistake.
What else would he use to hit you with?
Whatever's around.
His tyranny was such that even as an adult and a superstar, with great fame, power, and money, Michael still felt afraid of his father, and even felt like vomiting or fainting when he was in front of him.
Times when he'd come to see me and I would get sick.
I could tell you more details about his childhood and his biography, but we're here not so much to narrate events, but to talk about how all of this impacted Michael Jackson on a psychological level. We know that self-esteem is formed in a relational way. It's not something individual that you build on your own. You see yourself through the eyes that have looked at you, and you learn to relate to others and present yourself to the world based on what you've learned works. And what Michael probably learned is that in order to be loved, he had to. He had to be liked, he had to please, and he had to be perfect. Because if you fail, if you make a mistake, if you have any flaw, any imperfection, you will be rejected and even brutally punished. Somehow, a pattern is formed to constantly seek the approval of that gaze that watches, analyzes, judges, and criticizes. A gaze for which you're never enough, no matter how magnificent and perfect you are.
My father always used to say, don't bother, you know? And I felt like he knew every part, and if something went wrong, I felt like he could cover it up.
All of this will deeply shape the way Michael relates to others and to himself. This is something he also carried into his relationship with his body, with his image, and with fame and the public. But before we get to the physical aspect, the controversies, and the fame, we need to understand what the original wound is. That childhood turned into performance, into a product. Although Joseph, his father, was a source of harm, hatred, and pain, at the same time he was a loved object. And the thing is, Michael, just like the rest of the family, loved and at the same time hated Joseph. This is something that happens to many children of abusive and neglectful parents.
And he didn't allow us to call him Dad, and I wanted to call him Dad so badly. He said, I'm Joseph to you, not Dad.
And it's that when the person you need to survive is the same one who puts you in danger, when the person who is supposed to love and care for you the most is also the one who hurts you the most, a disorganized, insecure attachment pattern develops. You can't get too close, because getting close means danger, but you can't move away either, because you depend on that person to exist, and deep down you long for their love and approval. If you notice, this is something that can already be seen in Michael's adult relationships. He deeply longed to have connections, to relate, to love and be loved, but at the same time he felt that he couldn't trust people. He would withdraw into himself and preferred to connect with children and animals.
But he does it beautifully, doesn't he, Lily?
Say goodbye.
This was reinforced by the betrayals, ulterior motives, and exploitative relationships she experienced. The talent of the Jackson siblings, along with their father's high demands and also hard work, finally paid off. The group achieved great success and the promise of leaving Gary was fulfilled, but it came at a high price. Michael not only suffered his father's punishments and demands for perfection, but he also spent his entire childhood being that golden goose. His role in the Jacksons' success was crucial thanks to his magnificent voice, his charisma, his dancing, and that directly caused him to lose his childhood. There was no room for fun, for immaturity, for play, for fantasy. Everything was about rehearsing, working, producing, and constantly being even better. He was also exposed very early on to nightlife and sexualized environments typical of the adult world, for which a child does not have sufficient psychological resources.
While other kids were in bed, sleeping at night, I was performing in clubs, I was going to parties at 3 in the morning, the striptease acts would come on after us.
To give you an idea of what Michael's non-childhood was like, by the age of 14 he had already recorded 11 albums. While other kids were learning how to socialize, to be silly, to make fools of themselves, to laugh,
To discover who they were and what they wanted.
Michael could never ask himself what he wanted or who he wanted to be. He was directly assigned a role, an obligation, a part, a responsibility, and pressure.
Childhood was completely taken away from me. There was no Christmas, there were no birthdays, it was not a normal childhood. No normal pleasures of childhood, those were exchanged for hard work, struggle, and pain.
And this completely shapes a person's identity. Because the child who doesn't feel valuable just for existing, but instead feels valued for what they produce, applause, money, family pride, public recognition, their self-esteem and their very existence, their life, become completely dependent on their performance. There is no human self, no personal self with its own desires. I only exist on stage. Michael himself, in fact, said in interviews that he only felt like himself and happy when he was on stage, and that as soon as he got off, he felt lonely and miserable.
On stage, for me, was home. I was most comfortable, and I'm still most comfortable on stage. But once I got off stage, I was very sad. Really? Yeah.
And when the environment demands that the child suppress their needs to fit an expectation, what that child does is build an identity for the outside world. That works, that gives what is asked of them, that allows them to survive, to function, and through which they partially feel valued and loved. But deep down, their real self is buried, and the person no longer knows how to function, how to be in any other way. On stage, Michael seemed integrated. His body obeyed perfectly. Others looked at him with admiration. His sense of self felt strong. He knew exactly who he was. Michael Jackson. But off stage, that regulation, that identity, that sense of self all come under strain. That's why fame was simultaneously his illness and his medicine. It gave him existence, but it prevented him from developing a private, human, real self. It gave him love, but an impersonal love that couldn't really sustain him. It gave him identity, but an identity consumed by millions of people. That's why many artists are unable to leave the stage, fame, and performing, even though that public life and way of living destroys them. But of course, if there isn't a real self, a private life, a private self to provide support, the person falls apart without it. So even when Michael was already an adult, he kept doing the only thing he had been taught to do: create incredible music, be a magnificent artist, drive the crowds crazy. That's how he entered his early adulthood. Michael grew up with a strong internal dissonance. On one hand, he wanted to feel free, to fulfill himself, to build his autonomy, to make his own music, to follow his own desires.
Wonderful again. Of
That own self. But on the other hand, he felt a strong responsibility toward his family. Not only because of the role he played at home thanks to his talent, nor because of the fear he had of his father Joseph.
Buddy, do you think your father was too strict?
yes, he's going to kill me.
But also because of an upbringing, a family culture strongly centered on values, commitment, and duty. Many people don't realize the Jackson family were Jehovah's Witnesses. Michael, even after gaining fame, would disguise himself to join his mother in door-to-door conversations about Jehovah. That duality in him is quite interesting. How a young man with so much talent, fame, money, success, and even power, despite having all that in his hands and so many things within his reach, still chose to stay in the family home, under all the expectations and all the demands that were placed on him by staying there. It's very interesting how there was such a strong self in him, so powerful, so capable, so brave, so creative, so intelligent, so admired, but at the same time, there was a self that was so submissive, so accommodating, so insecure, so fearful, so naive, always trying to do the right thing, to be loved and accepted. And we have to understand
that psychological development is not uniform. A person can be extraordinarily developed in one area and
hurt or impoverished in another area. And the truth is that in Michael, there was a gap between his artistic intelligence, his aesthetic sophistication, his stage mastery, and his emotional and interpersonal maturity, which in many ways remained partially frozen. Those who knew him personally actually described this strange mix. Someone capable of conceptualizing thriller, of buying a record label, of negotiating contracts, and at the same time with a naivety and an interpersonal awkwardness that seemed like that of an innocent child. But even though it seems incompatible, it makes perfect sense if you think about it. This is the consequence of interrupted development. A life story in which certain parts didn't have the chance to develop. Just like that solid and unconditional self-esteem we've already talked about several times on this channel. That unconscious feeling that you are someone valuable and worthy of unconditional love for who you are, not for what you do or what you can offer. A certainty that you will be loved for who you are. Clearly, Michael grew up with many fractures and deficits in his psychological development, something that will soon be reflected in his physical appearance. Let's talk about this. Personally, I have to confess that I'm not a huge fan. I do like his music, but it's not the style of music I listen to the most. But objectively, it must be said that he's an incredible artist. But personally, I have to confess that there are many elements in his life and in his story that make me feel sad. For example, the fact that his physical changes, his appearance, his looks somehow overshadowed all his talent, all his work, and his creativity. At a certain point, it seemed like people talked more about his physical appearance than about his work. But anyway, let's analyze this point in order to understand and learn. Part of the emotional abuse and criticism from Michael's father was about his physical appearance, his big nose, his dark skin, his acne. He would often let him know that he was ugly, that he was flawed. And of course, the person who is supposed to love you the most, protect you, and give you self-esteem is the one who makes you feel the most insecure and flawed. It leads you to grow up with a deep sense of chronic shame. A chronic feeling of being flawed, that you're not okay, that you have to constantly improve, that it's never enough. And yes, maybe that perfectionism was inherently part of Michael's personality, and that perfectionism is also part of his musical success. But there's also clearly a pathological component.
in that baby. With anything, I'm a perfectionist. It's part of who I am.
Well, as I mentioned before, in his childhood, he grew up seeing that if he made any mistake or any error, that meant not being loved or accepted. The truth is that many people focus on making their physical appearance perfect because in some way it lets them deceive themselves. It makes them feel like they're doing something to solve that chronic feeling of inadequacy. But it's self-deception because no matter how much you change things, that feeling remains there.
No, I avoid looking in the mirror because I'm never satisfied with what I see.
So I keep going with my work, and with this I don't mean that trying to improve your physical appearance is a bad thing. I mean that when this urge to change your appearance has a deeper meaning, that is, when you're actually trying to feel worthy and lovable because of a psychological wound, no matter how much perfection you achieve, that doesn't go away. Be careful, as this struggle over appearance can involve other psychological layers. On one hand, when your life is pure chaos, exhaustion, uncertainty, and you have no agency over it, no ability to make decisions, changing your physical appearance is a way to feel like you have control over something in your life and over yourself. In fact, there are many people who, during times of great chaos, stress, and uncertainty in their lives, for example, develop problems with their relationship with food, because it's something they can control. And in the end, the brain seeks to have a sense of calm and control, even if it's false. But there's more. Many people, more or less unconsciously, feel the urge to change their physical appearance as a way of emotionally distancing themselves from that family that causes them harm. In the end, there are certain emotions, memories, and psychological elements that are triggered by specific stimuli we have associated with them. And if you share some physical trait with your family or with that parent who has hurt you, you might feel a sense of rejection toward that trait and a desire to change it. This is a defense mechanism called displacement. It involves transferring the emotion caused by one object onto another that is less threatening. In other words, I can't accept or connect with the anger I feel toward my father, toward my family. So instead, what I do is hate my nose. I change it, and that way I feel like I'm resolving that discomfort. So we see that in the relationship between Michael and his physical appearance, there isn't just simple vanity or superficiality. It's a physical level where psychological aspects come into play. On top of this, there are different illnesses and conditions that we know he had, like lupus, arthritis, vitiligo, which caused those spots on his skin, as well as several accidents he had while working, like the burn on his scalp or the fall that injured his back. All these elements are kind of the last straw, making an already complicated relationship with the body and self-image even worse. And on top of that, with a constant feeling of inadequacy and shame when seeing that people notice it, ask about it, point it out, and accuse. Many times, Michael has been asked in interviews about his surgeries, about his touch-ups.
How much plastic surgery have you had?
Very, very little.
Or they've outright accused him of bleaching his skin because he didn't want to be black. Remember, his childhood was marked by constant observation and criticism.
That judges. I've never had anything done to my hair. I've never had anything done to my eyes. I've never had anything done to my lips and all that kind of stuff. They go way too far. It's crazy.
Probably all this social focus on his appearance, on his imperfections, on his mistakes was re-traumatizing, which probably made her conflict with her image even worse, trying to improve it and perfect it and to fix those flaws that draw judgment and criticism. It's a pretty sad cycle. Michael's appearance, just like his identity, gradually faded away, and his eccentric looks made society focus even more on his oddities. In those parts of him that, as we've seen, might not have developed as much. But let's continue with early adulthood. Fortunately, amid this darkness and these wounds, Michael had some people who were a pillar of support for him. His mother Catherine, his sisters Latoya and Annette, his bodyguard. And this is important because when analyzing and understanding a person, we shouldn't just focus on what went wrong, but also on what protected them. In the end, many negative experiences can impact your psychological development. But sometimes, just one figure of love, acceptance, and emotional support can act as a strong protector against pathology and pain. There are people who have been emotionally saved by an aunt, a grandparent, or a teacher. There's a very beautiful letter that Michael wrote to his bodyguard, in which he tells him that, for him, he was really like a father. These good relationships surely made it so that, despite his deficits and difficulties, Michael preserved the ability to love and to be loved. That in his adult life he wanted to have a partner, to have children, to take care of them, that his songs were full of messages of love, of hope, of peace. That he kept that spirituality, that desire to help humanity, his charitable spirit. If these figures hadn't been there, providing support and emotional protection against everything else, his psychological structure probably could have shifted toward more destructive forms, both for himself and for others. However, even though her human side, empathetic and capable of loving and being loved, was preserved, it was full of wounds and scars. Something that Michael has often shared is the deep feeling of loneliness that he has always carried. Imagine being the most famous artist on the planet, surrounded by millions of people who praise you, but feeling completely alone.
Who are your real friends? I love our friends.
Personal friends. And you just can't live a normal life. You can't go anywhere. And you can't trust anyone either because everyone sees you as an opportunity, a transaction, something they can profit from. There was even a rabbi who did a kind of psychological therapy with Michael and recorded the conversations to sell them later. People never saw Michael Jackson as a human being. They always saw him, since he was a child, as Michael Jackson.
It must have been hard to have a real friend. How could it be? Yes.
And the truth is that when you can't connect through trust, authenticity, and spontaneity, there's something emotional that never gets resolved. And the thing is, no matter how many people you have around you, What you really need is to be accepted fully and unconditionally.
You had to be very brave, a sore finger.
You had no idea.
To feel that you can let go of all the masks, all the armor. To feel that you are seen and loved just as you are, not for what is expected of you. And unfortunately, when you grow up with the label of being a celebrity, that gets complicated.
I used to walk the streets, but I don't think anyone talked to me.
In that sense, combined with relational difficulties and his own insecurities, it becomes understandable that Michael would seek connections where he didn't feel that judgment, that calculation, that threat. Animals, children, childhood worlds. But just to be clear, understandable doesn't mean free of problems. Many people find that they feel more open or more interested in connecting with animals than with other adults. Because animals don't judge you, they don't criticize you, they don't expect to get anything from you. You can be completely yourself. Someone who feels this way with animals or with children probably longs for that kind of relationship in their adult life. They long to have a secure bond. But with Michael, it goes far beyond this relational fear. Let's talk about Neverland. Neverland wasn't just a ranch that Michael built to install rides and other amusements. It was an attempt to make a healing fantasy real.
I realize that many of today's problems are the result of the fact that children have had their childhood stolen from them.
The fantasy of a childhood without fear, without punishment, without demands, without adults invading. A place where the child can simply play without having to produce. What their mind was surely trying to do was to artificially create that place that their psyche didn't have at the time. Well,
you can't do things that other kids can do.
But it's also a defensive response to the adult world. A world that for Michael was associated with judgment, exploitation, criticism, betrayal, and hypocrisy. In Neverland, Michael could take refuge in that world of innocence. There, he wasn't a product. There, he could be a child. Just like physical alterations, creating your own world also gives you a certain sense of control. Remember that as a child, Michael couldn't control anything in his life. And really, in his adult life, he couldn't control much of what happened around him either. Press, rumors, opportunistic people, commercial pressures. But in Neverland, he's the one who builds it. He decides the rules. He has created his own world just the way he wants it. Trains, zoos, rides, sweets, children, animals, music, fantasy. Before, Michael was a child trapped in an adult world. And now he's an adult who creates a childlike world for himself. But that reversal carries a significant risk. Let's think about this. If Neverland somehow works as an extension of his inner world, of his healing fantasy, the people who enter that space, who become part of that world, can unintentionally find themselves absorbed by that healing fantasy. This is where boundary issues with children begin. When a traumatized adult tries to repair their childhood through children, situations of confusion and loss of boundaries can occur. As an aside, I'm not talking about abuse because it is not known for sure whether this happened or not. I've looked into it quite a bit through different sources, and I have drawn my own conclusions, leaning more towards his innocence. But as I said, this is my opinion, and we can't know for sure. I wouldn't want the analysis to focus on something we're unsure even happened. Whether he is innocent or not of these accusations, the reality is that the relationship between Michael and the children was unusual. Sleeping with other people's children, building emotional bonds with minors, publicly declaring, without awareness of the problem it can cause, that sharing a bed with children is something loving and innocent. On camera, in a documentary. It may have been a sincere, genuine, almost naive statement, but not seeing that the world will probably take those statements as something dangerous or alarming tells us certain things. Altered boundaries, emotional regression, possible neurodivergent traits that some of us clinicians perceive in Michael, and a significant difficulty in seeing what any average adult mind would see. In the end, innocence, no matter how innocent it is, doesn't eliminate that confusion of boundaries. And that tenderness, when it has a pathological background, can become something problematic. After these accusations and scandals, Michael's dependence on medication to regulate himself grew bigger and bigger, leading him to have some inappropriate behaviors. As far as we know, Michael didn't fit that classic profile of the hard-partying artist who uses substances recreationally. In his case, his relationship with substances was more connected to insomnia, physical pain, and emotional pain. It wasn't so much a search for euphoria and fun, but rather physical and emotional numbing. And it's hard to deny that Michael Jackson was subjected to an extreme level of media harassment. I think few public figures have been so persecuted, so caricatured, and so stripped of their humanity while they were still alive. And in the end, Michael was deeply affected because part of society saw him as a depraved being, as a monster.
I don't read all that's written about me. I wasn't aware that the world thought I was so strange and bizarre.
When your public identity becomes the antithesis of who you believe you are, it can be very painful. And I feel that in his story, both the most beautiful and brightest aspects of humanity and the ugliest and darkest are embodied.
I realize that many of today's problems are the result of the fact that children have had their childhood stolen.
His extraordinary talent, his generosity, his need to love and be loved, and that almost childlike faith in humanity, surrounded by selfishness, exploitation, blackmail, and harassment. A society that is fascinated by that child, by his voice, his talent, his creativity, that admires that light, that brilliance, but at the same time doesn't seem satisfied until it has absorbed him, caricatured him, and extinguished him. It reminds us that talent, fame, money, and beauty don't protect anyone from loneliness, from trauma, from suffering, because being looked at is not the same as being seen, and being admired is not the same as being loved. Michael's life leaves us with a rather uncomfortable question. How many people never feel loved for who they are, but only for what they do, for what they give, for what is expected of them? How many people are applauded and admired precisely for the same mask that is destroying them? I'm going to leave you with an analysis that you might find interesting, and that has some parallels with Michael Jackson's. It's a psychological analysis of Amy Winehouse. If you want to do therapy, but the cost is a problem, you should know that at my clinic, Estar Contigo Terapia, you can have deep, humane, high-quality therapy for only 49 euros a month. If you want to book your first session for free, here's the QR code, and I'll also leave the link in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. Honestly, I got emotional while doing it. I know there are many aspects of her life that I haven't mentioned, but otherwise, it would be a really long video to go over her entire biography and everything about her life. I mainly wanted to focus on her childhood and how that affected her personality and identity. I'm looking forward to reading your comments, and please, always comment respectfully. Bye, I love you, bye.
I love you too.